In the 2011 film Limitless, Bradley Cooper plays a character named Eddie Mora, whose life is defined by a particular kind of failure that most audiences misread entirely. Eddie is not stupid, he is not incapable, he is not lacking in raw intellectual material. What defines Eddie Mora, before he takes NZT, is that he exists at a lower resolution of perception than the environment around him actually demands for optimal functioning. His apartment is a disaster, not because he cannot clean it, but because he literally cannot perceive the causal chain between the accumulation of small neglects and the entropic state of his living space. His writing career has stalled, not because he lacks ideas, but because he cannot resolve the granular connections between the ideas he already possesses. His relationship is deteriorating not because he does not care, but because he cannot detect the micro-signals of dissatisfaction that his partner has been broadcasting for months. And this is the part that most audiences get wrong when they watch the film. The popular interpretation is that NZT allows Eddie to use 100% of his brain, which is itself a folk neuroscience myth that the film leans into for narrative convenience. But if you pay close attention to what actually changes about Eddie's behavior after taking the drug, you will notice something far more interesting and far more structurally significant than mere cognitive enhancement. What changes is his resolution. He does not suddenly know things he did not know before. He does not download new information from some external source. What happens is that the information that was always available to him, the details that were always present in his environment, suddenly become perceptible. He notices the sliver of a book spine on his landlord's wife's shelf and can now connect it to a conversation he overheard 3 years ago, which gives him the precise leverage point to transform a hostile interaction into a cooperative one. He observes the micro-expressions on a potential investor's face and can read the emotional subtext beneath the professional veneer, allowing him to calibrate his pitch in real time. He sees the patterns in stock market data that were always there, always embedded in the publicly available information, but that required a higher sampling rate of attention to detect. This is the key metaphor that unlocks an entire framework of analysis that, to my knowledge, has not been formally articulated in any single academic discipline, though its constituent elements are scattered across organizational theory, labor economics, ecological science, competitive strategy, and the sociology of Pierre Bourdieu. The framework I am calling Resolution Arbitrage describes a specific structural phenomenon in which an individual who has been trained, socialized, or cognitively calibrated for a high-resolution competitive environment deliberately or accidentally enters a lower-resolution competitive environment and, as a direct consequence of the mismatch between their perceptual operational capacity and the demands of the new environment, achieves returns that appear, from the outside, to be disproportionate, extraordinary, or even inexplicable. The key word in that definition is appears, because from the perspective of the individual operating the arbitrage, there is nothing magical happening at all. They are simply doing what they were trained to do, but in a space where that level of training is anomalously rare. And the delta between what they bring and what the environment expects generates a surplus of attention, a surplus of strategic precision, a surplus of pattern recognition, and ultimately a surplus of returns, whether those returns are measured in revenue and social capital and audience size, or in competitive victories. This is not a motivational framework. This is not a self-help principle. This is a structural observation about how competitive systems actually function when you examine the distribution of cognitive and institutional resources across different tiers of competition. And the single most instructive living example of this phenomenon is a man named Alex Hormozi, whose actual biography, when examined at sufficient resolution, reveals something far more interesting than the rags-to-riches entrepreneurial narrative that his audience has been trained to perceive. Let us begin with what is actually true about Alex Hormozi's background, because the popular narrative and the structural reality diverge in ways that are critical to understanding why resolution arbitrage works. Alex Hormozi was born in 1988 or 1989, depending on the source, to an Iranian immigrant family in the Baltimore metropolitan area. His father was a physician, which already positions the household within a specific socioeconomic and cultural stratum that emphasizes educational attainment, professional credentialing, and institutional prestige as the primary vectors of upward mobility. From 2004 to 2008, Hormozi attended the Gilman School, which is not merely an affluent private school, as one might casually describe it, but is in fact one of the most elite independent day schools in the state of Maryland. Founded in 1897 as the nation's first country day school, Gilman charges approximately $40,000 per year in tuition, maintains a student-to-teacher ratio of roughly 6-to-1, and sends its graduates to institutions like Princeton, Columbia, and the full spectrum of top-tier universities. Its alumni include United States senators, federal judges, NFL players, Tony Award-winning designers, and Wall Street executives. This is not upper-middle-class private education. This is the Baltimore equivalent of Dalton or Collegiate or Exeter, calibrated to produce individuals who will populate the commanding heights of American professional life. The Gilman School is a finishing mechanism for elite institutional pipelines, and Alex Hormozi was processed through it during the formative years of his adolescent cognitive and social development. Following Gilman, Hormozi enrolled at Vanderbilt University, which occupies a fascinating and often misunderstood position in the American higher education hierarchy. Vanderbilt is consistently ranked among the top 15 to 20 national universities. It is not, as some might casually assume, a regional institution riding on Southern charm. Its Peabody College of Education and Human Development is independently ranked among the best education schools in the country. Hormozi studied human and organizational development, which is Vanderbilt's largest undergraduate major and is housed within Peabody. The HOD curriculum is a genuinely multidisciplinary program that draws on psychology, organizational theory, sociology, political science, anthropology, and economics. It trains students in systems thinking, group dynamics, quantitative and qualitative research methods, and organizational behavior. Hormozi concentrated specifically in corporate strategy, graduated magna cum laude, and completed the degree in 3 years rather than 4. This is not a generic liberal arts degree from a mid-tier institution. This is an accelerated, high-performance academic track at a nationally elite university in a program specifically designed to produce individuals who can analyze organizations as systems and identify leverage points within those systems. When you understand what the HOD program actually teaches, Hormozi's later ability to walk into struggling gyms and immediately identify the 3 or 4 operational bottlenecks that were constraining their revenue stops, looking like entrepreneurial genius, and starts looking like a trained practitioner applying a diagnostic framework to a system that was operating well below the resolution threshold he had been calibrated to perceive. After graduating from Vanderbilt, Hormozi did exactly what the pipeline was designed to produce. He entered management consulting, working at a boutique strategy firm where he was involved in projects related to space cyber intelligence for the United States military. He has been characteristically candid about this period, noting in interviews that the work sounded much more impressive than it actually was, and that he gradually realized he was pursuing a career trajectory that reflected his father's expectations rather than his own desires. But here is the critical structural point that most analyses of Hormozi miss entirely. The consulting period, even though it was brief, approximately 2 years, deposited a specific set of cognitive and operational tools into Hormozi's repertoire. Strategy consulting, even at a boutique firm, trains you to decompose complex organizations into their component systems, identify inefficiencies, build analytical frameworks, and present recommendations with precision and confidence. These are not fitness industry skills. These are not gym owner skills. These are elite-tier organizational diagnostic skills, and they were layered on top of an already elite educational foundation from Gilman and Vanderbilt. When Hormozi left consulting in 2013, took his savings of roughly $5,000, and opened his first gym in Huntington Beach, California, he was not doing what the popular narrative suggests, which is starting from scratch as a scrappy entrepreneur. He was executing a resolution arbitrage. He was taking a cognitive and strategic toolkit that had been calibrated for McKinsey tier organizational analysis and deploying it in an industry where the median operator's strategic sophistication was, to put it generously, several standard deviations below the environment Hormozi had been trained to navigate. To understand why resolution arbitrage generates outsized returns, you have to understand a principle that operates across every competitive domain from labor markets to ecological systems to sports leagues. The distribution of capability within any competitive tier is not random. It is shaped by sorting mechanisms. In labor markets, these sorting mechanisms include educational credentialing, professional licensing, social networks, geographic clustering, and what economists call signaling, the process by which individuals use observable markers like degrees, job titles, and institutional affiliations to communicate unobservable qualities like competence, diligence, and strategic thinking. These sorting mechanisms are extraordinarily efficient at one thing and catastrophically bad at another. They are efficient at channeling high-capability individuals into high-competition environments. The Gilman to Vanderbilt to consulting pipeline is a sorting mechanism. It identifies individuals with high raw capability, refines that capability through structured training, and then routes them into professional environments where they will compete against other individuals who went through similarly rigorous pipelines. The result is that at the top tier of any profession, the competition is brutally compressed. The delta between the best and the 10th best management consultant at McKinsey is vanishingly small because the sorting mechanisms have already filtered out everyone who does not meet a very high baseline threshold of capability. But here is what the sorting mechanisms are catastrophically bad at. They are bad at preventing leakage. They cannot stop a high-resolution individual from choosing to exit the high-resolution environment and enter a lower-resolution one. And when that leakage occurs, it creates a structural anomaly that the lower-resolution environment is not equipped to absorb or counteract. Consider what happens in purely quantitative terms. If you are in the 95th percentile of capability within a high-resolution environment, you are competing against people in the 92nd through 99th percentile. Your relative advantage is marginal. You might outperform your peers by 5%, maybe 10%, in measurable outputs. But if you take that same 95th percentile capability and deploy it in an environment where the median operator is at the 50th percentile of the high-resolution environment scale, your relative advantage explodes. You are not 5% better than your competition. You're operating in a fundamentally different perceptual reality than your competition. You see patterns they cannot see. You identify leverage points they do not know exist. You execute strategies they have never encountered. And the market rewards this disproportionately because markets do not pay based on absolute capability. Markets pay based on relative capability within the competitive frame. This is a point that most people miss because they think about success in absolute terms. They ask, is Alex Hormozi smarter than a McKinsey partner? And the answer is almost certainly no, not in the specific domain of management consulting. But that is the wrong question. The right question is, was Alex Hormozi operating at a higher resolution than the median gym owner in 2013? And the answer to that question is an overwhelming, structurally guaranteed yes. And the returns he captured were proportional not to his absolute capability, but to the gap between his capability and the capability baseline of the environment he entered. This is precisely what Pierre Bourdieu was describing when he articulated the concept of cultural capital transfer across social fields. Bourdieu argued that the different forms of capital, economic, social, cultural, and symbolic, are not domain-locked. They can be converted across fields, and when they are converted into a field where that particular form of capital is scarce, the conversion rate is extraordinarily favorable. Hormozi did not merely bring business knowledge into the fitness industry. He brought institutionalized cultural capital in the form of an elite educational pedigree, embodied cultural capital in the form of internalized strategic thinking frameworks and communication skills honed through consulting, and social capital in the form of the behavioral norms and confidence patterns that are instilled by environments like Gilman and Vanderbilt. In the consulting world, these forms of capital were table stakes. Everyone had them. In the fitness industry, they were anomalous, rare, and therefore disproportionately valuable. In 1969, Lawrence Peter and Raymond Hull published the Peter Principle, which proposed that in a hierarchical organization, individuals tend to be promoted to the level of their incompetence. The mechanism is straightforward. A person who performs well at one level is promoted to the next level, where the skills required may be fundamentally different. They continue to be promoted as long as they succeed, until they reach a position where they can no longer perform effectively. At that point, promotion stops, and the individual remains stuck at the level where they are least competent. This principle has been validated by decades of organizational research and is now considered a canonical observation in management science. What Resolution Arbitrage describes is the precise inversion of this principle. Instead of an individual rising through a hierarchy until they reach the level of their incompetence, the individual descends through the hierarchy of competitive environments until they reach the level of their hypercompetence. And at that level, instead of being stuck and ineffective, they become dominant and disproportionately rewarded. The inverted Peter principle explains why Hormozi's trajectory looks so different from what the sorting mechanisms predicted. The sorting mechanisms said that someone with his educational pedigree and consulting experience should be competing for partnership at a strategy firm, or pursuing an MBA at a top 5 program, or entering a high-prestige finance role at Goldman Sachs or BlackRock. And in that predicted environment, Hormozi would have been competent, probably successful, but his returns would have been compressed by the density of equally capable competitors. Instead, by descending into the fitness industry, he reached a level where his capabilities were not just adequate, but anomalous. He was not merely competent in that environment. He was operating at a resolution that the environment had almost never encountered. This connects directly to the strategic framework that W. Chan Kim and Renee Mauborgne articulated in their 2005 book, Blue Ocean Strategy, which argues that the most profitable strategic move is not to compete more effectively within an existing market, the red ocean where competitors fight over shrinking margins, but to create or enter an uncontested market space, the blue ocean where competition is irrelevant because you have redefined the terms of engagement. What Kim and Mauborgne did not fully articulate, and what Resolution Arbitrage adds to their framework, is the mechanism by which an individual or organization can identify and access a blue ocean. Their framework focuses on value innovation, the simultaneous pursuit of differentiation and low cost. Resolution. Arbitrage adds a layer of analysis by noting that one of the most reliable ways to access a blue ocean is not through innovation per se, but through resolution migration, taking capabilities that are commoditized at one tier of competition and deploying them at a lower tier where they are not commoditized but scarce. The blue ocean is not always out there waiting to be discovered. Sometimes the blue ocean is beneath you. Sometimes the uncontested market space is created not by inventing something new, but by bringing something old, something that is standard operating procedure in your native environment, into an environment where it has never been seen before. Consider the concrete operational implications of this for Hormozi's gym business. What did he actually do when he walked into a struggling gym? He did not invent new exercises. He did not discover new principles of fitness. What he did was apply the diagnostic frameworks he had learned in consulting and at Vanderbilt to identify the specific bottlenecks in the gym's customer acquisition, retention, and monetization processes. He looked at the gym the way a management consultant looks at a Fortune 500 company, as a system with inputs, throughputs, outputs, feedback loops, and identifiable points of leverage. The gym owners he was helping had never seen their businesses analyzed this way. They were operating at a resolution where a gym was a place where people came to exercise and paid a monthly fee. Hormozi was operating at a resolution where a gym was a complex system of customer lifetime value calculations, lead generation funnels, upsell architectures, retention mechanics, and pricing psychology. The gap between these two resolutions was the arbitrage. And the returns Hormozi captured, which eventually scaled to a $46 million exit on gym launch alone, were directly proportional to the size of that gap. The case of Lex Fridman illustrates resolution arbitrage operating through a different vector than Hormozi, specifically through the conversion of academic and epistemic capital into attention economy returns. To understand why Fridman's podcast became one of the most influential media properties in technology and politics, you have to understand precisely where Fridman sits within the academic hierarchy, and why that specific position, neither too high nor too low, was optimal for the arbitrage. Fridman was born in Chikalovsk, in the Tajik Soviet Socialist Republic, grew up in Moscow, and immigrated to the United States, settling in the Chicago area. He attended Neuqua Valley High School in Naperville, Illinois, and then earned his bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees all at Drexel University in Philadelphia. His PhD, completed in 2014 in electrical and computer engineering, focused on behavioral biometrics for active authentication, specifically investigating how machine learning could be used to continuously verify user identity through patterns like keystroke dynamics and mouse trajectories. This is legitimate research. It resulted in publications, including a CHI 2018 Honorable Mention Award for work on cognitive load estimation under real-world driving conditions. But it is not frontier AI research. It is not the kind of work that gets you recruited to DeepMind's research team or earns you a tenured professorship at Stanford's AI lab. Drexel is a respectable institution, but it operates at a different tier of the academic hierarchy than MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, or Berkeley when it comes to AI research prestige. What Fridman did after his PhD is where the resolution arbitrage begins. In 2015, he joined MIT's Age Lab as a research scientist, working on driver behavior analytics and human-AI interaction. He taught non-credit courses during MIT's independent activities period, including the popular course on deep learning for self-driving cars. In 2019, he authored a study claiming that drivers remained focused while using Tesla's autopilot system, a study that was not peer-reviewed and was criticized by established AI safety researchers, but that caught the attention of Elon Musk, who praised it publicly. This endorsement was the catalytic event. Following the Musk signal boost, Fridman transitioned to an unpaid role at MIT and pivoted increasingly toward podcasting. As of 2022, he holds the title of research scientist at MIT's Laboratory for Information and Decision Systems, but his research publication activity dropped significantly after 2019, and he is not listed in the teaching faculty for any credit-bearing courses. The critical observation is this. Within the academic AI research community, Fridman occupies a position that would be roughly characterized as a mid-career research scientist with a respectable but not distinguished publication record from a non-elite doctoral institution, holding a research affiliation at a world-class university without the full weight of a tenured or tenure-track appointment. This is a perfectly honorable position, but it does not confer the kind of outsized recognition, influence, or compensation that Fridman has achieved through his podcast. The podcast is where the resolution arbitrage operates. The long-form interview podcast space, when Fridman entered it in 2018, was a relatively low-resolution environment in terms of epistemic credibility. The dominant figures were Joe Rogan, whose authority derived from cultural influence and audience size rather than academic credentialing, and a smattering of journalists and commentators with no formal technical training whatsoever. Into this environment, Fridman brought genuine, if moderate, academic credentials, a real PhD, real research experience, a real institutional affiliation with MIT, and enough technical fluency to conduct substantive conversations with experts in AI, physics, mathematics, and engineering. In the academic environment, these credentials were average. In the podcast environment, they were extraordinary. The delta between Fridman's epistemic resolution and the median epistemic resolution of the podcast landscape was enormous, and the returns he captured were proportional to that delta. He now hosts conversations with heads of state, Fortune 500 CEOs, Nobel laureates, and the most prominent figures in technology, reaching an audience of millions. His academic credentials, which within academia would position him as a competent but unremarkable researcher, function in the media space as a kind of epistemic superpower, conferring a level of authority and access that far exceeds what those same credentials would generate within their native competitive environment. The TBPN case provides what may be the most structurally clean demonstration of resolution arbitrage in the media and technology ecosystem, particularly because the outcome, acquisition by OpenAI in April of 2026, provides a definitive measurement of the returns generated by the arbitrage. John Coogan's background is not one of failure, as a surface-level reading might suggest. Coogan co-founded Soylent, the meal replacement company, where he served as chief technology officer from 2013 to 2017. Soylent went through Y Combinator, attracted significant venture funding, and became a genuinely influential consumer product that sparked an entire category of nutritionally complete meal replacements. After leaving Soylent, Coogan co-founded Lucy, a tobacco-free nicotine products company, which also went through Y Combinator and which Coogan built while simultaneously serving as an entrepreneur in residence at Peter Thiel's Founders Fund, one of the most prestigious venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. Lucy's strategic thesis was sophisticated. Coogan identified that the FDA regulatory moat around nicotine products was closing fast, creating a narrow window for a non-tobacco company to establish a position before the regulatory barriers became insurmountable. He recognized that big tobacco companies, despite their massive resources, had degraded internal talent and were vulnerable to a well-executed challenger brand. This is not the resume of someone who failed at startups. This is the resume of someone who operated at a high resolution within the startup ecosystem, achieving real outcomes. Soylent was a category-defining product, but not the kind of outsized returns, a billion-dollar unicorn exit, that the Silicon Valley sorting mechanism uses as its primary metric of success. When Coogan and his co-host, Jordy Hayes, launched TBPN, the Technology Business Programming Network, in 2024 as a daily live tech talk show, they were executing a textbook resolution arbitrage. They took the deep insider knowledge, the personal networks, the pattern recognition capabilities, and the analytical frameworks that they had developed through years of operating within the Y Combinator and Founders Fund ecosystem, and they deployed those assets in the media space, which, relative to the startup ecosystem, operates at a significantly lower resolution of technological and business sophistication. The tech media landscape in 2024 was populated primarily by journalists without operating experience, commentators without investment backgrounds, and influencers without institutional credibility. Into this environment, Coogan brought the ability to analyze a company's business model the way a founder's fund partner would, to identify the strategic logic behind a product decision the way a Y Combinator-trained founder would, and to contextualize a technology trend within the broader investment landscape the way someone who had spent years inside elite VC firms would. The result was that TBPN, in barely a year, became what the New York Times described as Silicon Valley's newest obsession, secured interviews with Mark Zuckerberg, Sam Altman, Satya Nadella, and Mark Cuban, and was ultimately acquired by OpenAI. The acquisition by OpenAI is the definitive proof point for resolution arbitrage. Coogan's actual startup outcomes did not independently generate the kind of value that would attract OpenAI's attention, but his startup tier resolution, deployed in the media space, generated a media property that OpenAI valued enough to acquire. The North Dakota State Bison football program provides the institutional scale version of the same phenomenon. NDSU has won 10 FCS national championships in 14 seasons, a dominance so absolute that Sports Illustrated described it as one of the greatest dynasties in all of sports. The Bison have a 51-5 all-time record in FCS playoff games. They have produced multiple NFL draft picks, including Carson Wentz, who was selected second overall in 2016, and Trey Lance, who went third overall in 2021. Their 2019 team went 16-0, the best record in modern Division I football history. The mechanism driving this dominance is a resolution arbitrage at the institutional level. NDSU operates with resources, coaching infrastructure, recruiting capabilities, and organizational sophistication that are calibrated to an FBS level standard, but they compete within the FCS, where the medium program operates with significantly fewer resources. The delta between NDSU's institutional resolution and the FCS baseline is so large that it produces the same kind of outsized returns that Hormozi achieved in the fitness industry and Fridman achieved in podcasting. And here is the final structural confirmation of the theory. NDSU is moving to the FBS, joining the Mountain West Conference on July 1st, 2026. The arbitrage window is closing. When the Bison enter an environment where their resource level is closer to the competitive baseline, the outsized returns will compress. They will still be good. They will probably still be competitive, But they will not be dynastically dominant because the resolution gap that generated the dominance will have been eliminated. What makes resolution arbitrage a genuinely novel theoretical contribution is not that the individual components are new. Each component has been described, at least partially, within its native discipline. What is new is the synthesis, the recognition that these disparate frameworks are all describing different facets of the same structural phenomenon. Let me walk through the disciplinary architecture to demonstrate the degree of convergence. In sociology, Pierre Bourdieu's theory of capital conversion across social fields provides the most direct antecedent. Bourdieu argued that cultural capital, which includes educational credentials, knowledge, and the habituated dispositions that elite institutions instill in their members, can be converted into other forms of capital, economic, social, and symbolic, when it is deployed in a new field. The conversion rate depends on the relative scarcity of that particular form of capital within the target field. When Hormozi converted his Vanderbilt education, his consulting-trained analytical frameworks, and his Gilman-instilled behavioral norms into the fitness industry, he was executing precisely the kind of cross-field capital conversion that Bourdieu described. The fitness industry placed almost no premium on institutionalized cultural capital, which meant that Hormozi's capital was simultaneously anomalous and disproportionately valuable. In competitive strategy, Michael Porter's Five Forces framework and the subsequent Blue Ocean strategy of Kim and Mulborn both address the question of how competitive intensity shapes returns. Porter showed that industries with high rivalry, low barriers to entry, and abundant substitutes generate compressed returns for all participants. Resolution. Arbitrage adds a specific mechanism to this framework. It shows that one of the most effective ways to escape a high rivalry environment is not to innovate within it, which is what most strategy frameworks recommend, but to exit it entirely and enter an environment where your existing capabilities constitute a disproportionate advantage. In ecology, the competitive exclusion principle, articulated by Georgi Gauss in 1934, states that two species competing for the same resources in the same ecological niche cannot stably coexist. One will eventually outcompete the other. But the principle also implies that an organism that moves into a niche where it faces less competition will thrive disproportionately. This is precisely what NDSU did in the FCS, what Fridman did in podcasting, and what Hormozi did in fitness. They moved into ecological niches where their specific competitive traits were not merely adequate, but overwhelming relative to the existing inhabitants. In labor economics, signaling theory, developed by Michael Spence in the 1970s, explains how individuals use educational credentials and other observable markers to signal unobservable qualities to potential employers or markets. Resolution. Arbitrage exploits a specific failure mode of signaling theory, the signal-environment mismatch. Hormozi's Vanderbilt degree and consulting experience were signals calibrated for the professional services labor market. When he entered the fitness industry, those signals were illegible to many participants in that market, which meant that competitors could not accurately assess his capability level. They could not see the threat coming because the signals he carried were not the signals that the fitness industry had been trained to read. This information asymmetry compounded the resolution gap, because not only was Hormozi operating at a higher resolution, but his competitors did not even have the perceptual framework to recognize that a higher resolution was being deployed against them. In Clayton Christensen's disruption theory, the canonical pattern is that a low-end or new market entrant gradually improves until it displaces established incumbents. Resolution. Arbitrage inverts this. Instead of a low-resolution actor improving to challenge high-resolution incumbents, it describes a high-resolution actor descending to dominate a low-resolution market. The mechanism is the mirror image of disruption. Instead of being underestimated because you are below the market's quality threshold, you are underestimated because the market does not have a framework for recognizing that you are operating above its resolution ceiling. Now let us address the marketing implications directly, because this is where resolution arbitrage transforms from an interesting academic observation into an actionable strategic framework. The title of this analysis promises a secret marketing hack that Alex Hormozi will never tell you, and the reason he will never tell you is not that he is deliberately withholding information. It is that the hack is structural, not tactical. It is embedded in the architecture of his biography, not in the content of his advice. When Hormozi teaches marketing, he teaches the outputs of resolution arbitrage: how to construct compelling offers, how to build lead generation systems, how to optimize customer acquisition costs, how to structure pricing for maximum perceived value. These are all legitimate and useful tactical insights, but they are the downstream consequences of the upstream structural advantage, which is that Hormozi was trained to see business systems at a resolution that his target audience, small and medium-sized business owners, simply cannot perceive. The real marketing hack is not any specific tactic. The real marketing hack is the resolution differential itself. Consider what this means for anyone trying to replicate Hormozi's success by following his tactical advice. If you implement his offer creation framework, but you are operating at the same resolution as every other business owner in your space, you will get marginal improvements. You will be slightly better at creating offers, slightly better at structuring your pricing, slightly better at generating leads. But you will not achieve the outsized returns that Hormozi achieved because those returns were not generated by the tactics. They were generated by the gap between his perceptual operational resolution and the resolution of the competitive environment. This is the hidden asymmetry in all guru-based marketing education. The guru's advice is extracted from a context where the guru had a structural advantage that the audience does not share and usually cannot replicate. It is like a 6'8" basketball player teaching shooting form to someone who is 5'9". The advice about shooting form may be technically correct, but the 6'8" player's success was not primarily attributable to his shooting form. It was primarily attributable to the physical advantage that allowed his shooting form to be deployed from positions that shorter players cannot access. The actionable insight from Resolution Arbitrage is not to copy Hormozi's tactics. It is to identify your own resolution differential and then strategically position yourself in a market where that differential is maximized. This means conducting an honest audit of your cognitive, educational, experiential, and institutional capital, and then asking a specific question: in what competitive environment would my existing capital be anomalously valuable? If you have a technical background in data science and you are competing for software engineering roles at Meta, your capital is table stakes. Everyone around you has similar capabilities. But if you take that same technical background and enter a field like commercial real estate underwriting or insurance claims analysis or nonprofit fundraising operations, you are introducing analytical capabilities that the existing participants in those fields have rarely encountered. Your Python skills, your statistical reasoning, your comfort with large data sets, these are not differentiators at Meta. They are superpowers in environments where the median analytical tool is still a spreadsheet with manual formulas. The same principle applies to content creation and audience building, which is where this framework becomes most directly relevant to marketing strategy. Most content creators in any given niche are operating at the resolution of that niche. A fitness creator creates fitness content at fitness industry resolution. A real estate creator creates real estate content at real estate industry resolution. What Hormozi did, and what Fridman did, and what Coogan did, is create content at a resolution that exceeded the expectations of their respective niches. Hormozi's marketing content is not fitness industry marketing content. It is consulting tier strategic analysis delivered in a fitness industry context. Fridman's podcast is not typical tech media content. It is academic tier intellectual engagement delivered in a media context. When you operate at a higher resolution than your content environment expects, the audience perceives it as depth, as insight, as value, and they reward it with attention, loyalty, and money. This is the real content strategy that no marketing course teaches because it cannot be taught as a tactic. It has to be understood as a structural position. Any honest analysis of resolution arbitrage must also address its failure modes, because the framework is not a guarantee of success, but a description of a structural position that, under specific conditions, generates outsized returns. Those conditions can fail to materialize, can change over time, or can be undermined by factors that the individual executing the arbitrage did not anticipate. The first and most common failure mode is what I call the illegibility trap. This occurs when the individual's resolution is so far above the baseline of the target environment that the market cannot parse the value being offered. If you are a theoretical physicist who enters the life coaching industry, your ability to model human behavior using complex systems dynamics may be genuinely superior to the folk psychological frameworks that most life coaches use. But if your target audience cannot understand your framework, if the gap between your resolution and their resolution is too wide for effective communication, then the arbitrage fails. The market does not reward resolution it cannot perceive. It rewards resolution it can perceive as valuable but cannot replicate. There is a sweet spot, and Hormozi hit it precisely. His resolution was high enough to produce strategies that gym owners had never seen, but low enough that those gym owners could understand, implement, and attribute their improved results to his methods. If his strategies had been pitched at the level of a McKinsey presentation, full of DCF models and three-horizon growth frameworks, the gym owners would have tuned out, and the arbitrage would have collapsed. The second failure mode is cultural friction. Every competitive environment has a culture, a set of norms, values, communication styles, and status hierarchies that govern how participants interact with each other and evaluate each other's contributions. When a high-resolution individual enters a lower-resolution environment, they bring not only superior capabilities, but also the cultural norms of their native environment, and those norms may be incompatible with the target environment in ways that generate resistance rather than admiration. The consulting world values speed, analytical precision, direct communication, and data-driven decision-making. Many lower-resolution environments value relationships, intuition, loyalty, experience-based credibility, and a more organic, less systematic approach to problem solving. If the high-resolution individual cannot code switch, if they cannot adapt their communication and behavioral style to the cultural expectations of the new environment, the market will reject them, not because their capabilities are inadequate, but because their cultural presentation is abrasive. Hormozi navigated this successfully, in part because the fitness industry, despite its lower analytical resolution, has a cultural respect for intensity, discipline, and direct communication that aligned well with consulting world norms. A different target environment might have penalized those same traits. The third failure mode is arbitrage window closure. Resolution. Arbitrage is a positional advantage, not a permanent one. The outsized returns it generates are a function of the gap between the individual's resolution and the environment's resolution, and that gap can narrow over time through two mechanisms. The individual's resolution may decline as they spend more time in the lower resolution environment and lose touch with the capabilities and frameworks of their native tier. Or the environment's resolution may increase as the market professionalizes, as competitors observe and imitate the successful strategies, or as institutional sorting mechanisms redirect more high-resolution individuals into the space. North Dakota State's move to the FBS is the clearest example of arbitrage window closure. The Bison dominated the FCS for 14 years because they operated at an FBS tier resolution within an FCS environment. When they enter the FBS in 2026, the gap closes and the outsized returns will compress. Similarly, the long-form podcast space in 2018 was a low-resolution environment where Fridman's moderate academic credentials constituted a disproportionate advantage. By 2026, the space has been flooded with credentialed academics, former executives, and domain experts who are raising the baseline resolution. Fridman remained successful, but the structural advantage that launched his trajectory is smaller than it was 6 years ago. The implication for anyone attempting to execute a resolution arbitrage is clear. Timing matters. The arbitrage is most profitable when the resolution gap is widest, which typically means entering the lower resolution space before it begins to professionalize. Once the gap begins to narrow, the returns compress toward the mean, and the strategy shifts from capturing outsized returns to defending a market position that was established during the arbitrage window. Let me now synthesize the entire framework into its most comprehensive and actionable form, because resolution arbitrage is not merely an explanatory model for understanding why certain individuals achieve outsized success. It is a prescriptive framework that, when properly understood and executed, allows an individual to deliberately engineer the structural conditions for disproportionate returns. The framework has 5 components, each of which must be executed in sequence. The first component is the resolution audit, which requires the individual to conduct an honest, unsentimental assessment of their native resolution tier and the specific capital assets they possess. This means identifying not just what you know, but what you know relative to the environments you could potentially enter. A computer science graduate from a top 20 program has specific technical capital, data structures, algorithms, systems design, programming fluency, that is table stakes in the software engineering labor market, but anomalous in dozens of other industries. A former investment banker has specific financial modeling, valuation, and deal structuring capital that is commoditized on Wall Street, but extraordinarily rare in industries like commercial real estate development, healthcare practice management, or nonprofit fundraising. The audit is not about identifying what you are best at in absolute terms. It is about identifying where the delta between your resolution and the environmental resolution is largest. The second component is the environmental scan, which requires mapping the competitive landscape's 1 to 2 resolution tiers below your native environment and identifying the specific domains where your capital assets are scarcest. This is not a trivial exercise, because it requires overcoming the powerful social and psychological forces that discourage downward mobility. The sorting mechanisms that route high-resolution individuals into high-resolution environments are reinforced by status hierarchies, peer expectations, family pressure, and internalized narratives about what constitutes legitimate success. Hormozi has spoken candidly about the pressure he felt from his father's expectations. Fridman has been criticized by academic colleagues who view his podcasting as a departure from serious research. Coogan spent years in the startup ecosystem before pivoting to media. In each case, the individual had to resist the gravitational pull of their native tier's status hierarchy in order to execute the arbitrage. This is one of the reasons resolution arbitrage is rare, despite being structurally advantageous. The same sorting mechanisms that create the resolution gap also create powerful disincentives for crossing it. The third component is gap evaluation, which requires assessing 3 critical variables: the size of the resolution gap, which determines the potential magnitude of the returns, the cultural compatibility between your native norms and the target environment's norms, which determines whether the arbitrage will be received as valuable or abrasive, and the arbitrage window timeline, which determines how long the outsized returns can be sustained before the gap narrows. The ideal target environment has a large resolution gap, high cultural compatibility, and a long arbitrage window. The fitness industry in 2013 was ideal for Hormozi on all three dimensions. The analytical resolution gap was enormous. The culture valued the intensity and directness that his background instilled, and the industry was years away from the kind of professionalization that would narrow the gap. The long-form podcast space in 2018 was similarly ideal for Fridman. By contrast, an environment with a large resolution gap but low cultural compatibility, such as a traditional craftsman's guild for someone with a tech background, might generate friction that negates the arbitrage's potential returns. The fourth component is entry execution, which requires deploying your existing capital in the target environment without diluting your resolution. This is a subtle but critical point. The temptation upon entering a lower resolution environment is to adapt to it, to lower your standards, to simplify your frameworks, to conform to the existing level of sophistication. But this is precisely the wrong move because it eliminates the resolution differential that generates the outsized returns. Hormozi did not simplify his analytical approach when he entered the fitness industry. He maintained his consulting tier analytical frameworks and found ways to translate them into language that gym owners could understand and act upon. Fridman did not dumb down his intellectual approach for the podcast audience. He maintained academic tier conversational depth while making it accessible through his interview format. The goal is to maintain your resolution while adapting your communication, not to reduce your resolution to match the environment. The fifth and final component is return extraction, which requires capturing the outsized returns proportional to the resolution differential before the arbitrage window closes. This means moving aggressively during the period of maximum gap, building assets, audience, revenue, and reputation that will sustain your position even after the gap narrows. Hormozi built Gym Launch into a scalable licensing business, and then sold it for $46 million before the fitness industry's analytical resolution caught up to his methods. He then moved to acquisition.com, a holding company model that allowed him to apply the same resolution arbitrage across multiple industries simultaneously. Fridman built his podcast audience to millions of subscribers during the period when his academic credentials were maximally anomalous in the media space, creating a brand and a network of relationships that now sustain his influence even as the podcast landscape becomes more competitive. Coogan built TBPN to the point of acquisition by OpenAI within a year of launch, capturing the value of the arbitrage before the tech media space fully professionalized. The fundamental insight of resolution arbitrage, the insight that Alex Hormozi will never articulate because it would undermine the universalist framing of his marketing education business, is that position matters more than tactics. Where you compete matters more than how you compete. The resolution at which you operate matters more than the specific strategies you deploy. When you enter an environment where your baseline resolution exceeds the environmental ceiling, the tactics almost do not matter. You will outperform because you are seeing the game at a fidelity that your competitors cannot match. The secret is not what Hormozi teaches. The secret is where Hormozi sits. And until you understand the structural geometry of resolution arbitrage, you will keep trying to replicate his tactics from within an environment where those tactics cannot produce the same returns because you are operating at the resolution that the environment expects rather than at a resolution that exceeds it. Resolution is the secret. Resolution has always been the secret. And now you know.